Good evening, friends. Tonight, we're travelling back to a world of candlelight and uncertainty, to the year 1348, when people across medieval Europe searched desperately for ways to cure the plague. If you enjoy these calm, haunting journeys through history, please like and subscribe. It truly helps me keep creating. And write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always wonderful to see listeners from all around the world. Now lower the lights, let the sound settle around you, and let's step quietly into the past together. I write this in the 43rd year of my life, which is to say, I have outlived most men of my generation by a dozen winters or more. My hand trembles as it moves across the vellum, not from age alone, but from the weight of what I must set down. There are things a man carries that grow heavier with time, not lighter. Memory is one such burden. They call me Brother Thomas now, though I was not always a man of the cloth. In those days, the days I speak of, I was apprentice to Master William, an apothecary of some renown in the city of Norwich. I was 17 years old when the pestilence came, young enough to believe the world would always remain as I found it, old enough to understand that what I witnessed would mark me forever. 26 years have passed since the year of the Great Dying. I have prayed daily for the grace to forget. Yet God, in his wisdom, has seen fit to preserve every detail with cruel clarity. The smell of burning rosemary mixed with tar, the sound of cartwheels on cobblestones before dawn, the texture of dried wormwood between my fingers, the taste of fear, which is to say the taste of nothing at all, for terror steals even the flavour from bread. I set these words down not as confession, though God knows I have much to confess. Nor do I write to absolve myself of the failures that followed. I write because someone must remember what we tried, what we believed, and how desperately we reached for hope, even as it slipped through our fingers like water through a sieve. We burned incense against the air. We prayed against the wind. We bled ourselves for mercy. None of it worked. Yet somehow, I remained. The first rumours came in autumn, in the year of our Lord 1348. September had turned the leaves to copper and gold, and the harvest had been good enough that men spoke of a mild winter ahead. Master William and I were preparing the shop for the season's trade-grinding bark for fever remedies, steeping herbs in wine for winter coughs, mixing salves for chilblains that would come when the frost arrived. The shop stood on Pottergate, narrow and tall like all the buildings pressed together in that quarter of the city. The ground floor held our workroom and the counter where customers came. Above that, Master William kept his private chamber, and in the attic I had my bed among the drying herbs that hung from the rafters. The air there was thick with the scent of lavender and sage, so strong that even now, decades later, I cannot smell those herbs without feeling 17 again, ignorant of what approached. Master William was a man of perhaps 50 years, though he seemed ancient to me then. He had studied in Salerno, or so he claimed, and kept books in Latin that I could not read. His beard was grey as ash, trimmed short in the fashion of physicians who did not wish to carry disease in their hair. He wore a leather apron stained with years of work, the brown of walnut hulls, the yellow of saffron, the deep purple of madder root. His hands were steady and precise, and he spoke rarely, which I mistook for wisdom. I learned my trade by watching and doing, how to recognize good poppy seed from bad, how to store dried mushrooms so they would not crumble, how to mix a poultice that would draw out infection without burning the skin, how to make a tincture strong enough to work but weak enough not to bring the end of the road to a patient already suffering. It was careful work, and I was proud of the skill my hands were learning. On a Tuesday in late September, a merchant came into the shop seeking a remedy for flux. He was a trader in wool, recently returned from Bristol, and his face had the greyish cast of a man who had spent too many days at sea or in the saddle. Master William sold him a mixture of oak bark and honey, standard treatment for a loose bowel, and bid him drink it with red wine. As the merchant turned to leave, he paused at the threshold. "They say there is a strange sickness in the port cities," he said, not looking at us but at the street beyond. "In Bristol and Southampton, people falling ill within a day and gone by the third morning. I saw a house marked with a cross on the door. The whole family inside, they said." Master William's hands, which had been wrapping herbs in cloth, went still. "What manner of sickness?" he asked. The merchant shrugged. a gesture meant to convey indifference but betraying unease in the tightness of his shoulders. Fever and swellings, I heard, and marks on the skin, dark as storm clouds. The physicians there have no name for it, or if they do, they are not speaking it aloud. He left then, and Master William returned to his work, though I noticed his movements had lost their usual rhythm. That evening, as we closed the shutters against the autumn chill, he spoke without looking at me. "Swellings and fever," he said, "marks on the skin. These are the signs of pestilence. If it has reached Bristol, it will come here." I asked him what we should do, and he shook his head. "Prepare," he said, "and pray." October arrived with rain. The streets turned to mud, and the gutters ran with waste and water. Trade continued as before, though I noticed more people coming to the shop for preventatives garlic to hang above doorways, amulets blessed by priests, mixtures of herbs to burn in the hearth. Master William filled these requests without comment, though once, after a woman left with a sachet of dried rue and vervan to ward off evil spirits, I asked him if he believed such things had power. "Belief itself has power," he said. "If a man thinks he is protected, his heart is steadier. A steady heart may survive what a fearful one cannot." Was this truth or kindness? I did not know then, and I am not certain even now. By November, the rumours had become facts. A carter brought news that the pestilence had reached Cambridge. A pardoner travelling north spoke of whole villages abandoned between London and Norwich. The churches began holding special masses, and the bells rang more frequently, tolling for souls we could not see but knew were multiplying. Master William began to spend his evenings reading by candlelight, poring over manuscripts he kept locked in a wooden chest. I would see him from the ladder to the attic, his grey head bent over pages that looked older than memory, his lips moving silently as he read. When I asked what he sought, he told me he was looking for precedents, for records of past plagues and what had been tried against them. "The ancients knew things we have forgotten," he said. "Galen wrote of pestilence. Hippocrates described the treatment of fever. If this sickness has come before, there must be wisdom in what was done." I believed him because I had no choice. What else was apprenticeship but the trust that one's master possessed knowledge worth the labour of learning? December brought the first frost and the first case within the city walls. A dyer's apprentice on Coalgate fell ill on a Wednesday. By Friday he had developed swellings in his neck and under his arms, hard as stones and dark with gathering poison. By Saturday evening he had reached the silence that follows all struggle. The house was marked with a painted cross, red as the dyer's own pigment. The door was nailed shut with the family inside. This was the law, meant to contain the sickness, and though the family wailed and pleaded to be let out, the bailiff stood firm. It was cruelty in service of mercy, or so we told ourselves. Master William and I heard the news at the market on Sunday morning. The square was less crowded than usual, and those who had come kept their distance from one another, as if proximity itself might carry danger. The baker's wife wore a cloth across her mouth and nose. The fishmonger burned green wood in a brazier beside his stall, filling the air with white smoke. "It is here," Master William said simply, and we returned to the shop in silence. That afternoon he gathered what supplies we had and took inventory. Dried wormwood and rue for fumigation, vinegar by the barrel, goose grease for poultices, myrrh and frankincense for incense, theriac the great cure-all, which he kept in a locked cabinet because it contained viper's flesh and was worth more than silver by weight. He also brought down a leather mask from his chamber, shaped like the face of a bird with a long beak. Inside the beak were compartments for herbs and spices, meant to purify the air before it reached the nose and mouth. I'd seen such masks before in illustrations, but never in use. It made him look like a creature from a bestiary, half man and half raven. "If we are called to attend the sick," he said, "we will need protection. The pestilence travels in corrupt air, in the miasma that rises from swamps and graves. We must purify what we breathe." I asked if he believed the mask would work, and he looked at me with eyes that seemed very tired. "I believe we must try everything," he said, "because if we try nothing, we are already lost." The winter of 1348 passed in a growing darkness. The pestilence moved through Norwich like a tide, slow and then sudden, claiming first a household, then a street, then entire parishes. The bells tolled so frequently that they became part of the city's soundscape, no more remarkable than the cries of gulls or the creak of windmills. Master William and I were called upon more and more frequently, sometimes to dispense remedies, sometimes simply to attend and bear witness, because the physicians of the city would not go where the sickness dwelt, and the priests were overwhelmed with the business of final prayers. We went in our leather masks, smelling the herbs crushed into the beaks with every breath. Lavender and mint, camphor and cloves. The scents were meant to protect us, to drive back the corruption in the air, but they also marked us as different, as men who walked between the world of the living and the territory of the dying. The houses we entered were dim and close, shutters sealed against the winter and the sickness both. The air inside was thick with smoke from fires kept burning day and night, meant to purify the atmosphere. Often there were herbs scattered on the floors, rosemary and thyme crushed underfoot to release their essence. The sick lay in their beds or on pallets by the hearth, and the smell of their suffering mixed with the smoke and herbs into something that coated the throat and lungs. The swellings appeared most commonly in the neck, under the arms, or in the groin. They began as hard lumps beneath the skin and grew rapidly, sometimes to the size of an apple, dark and hot to the touch. The flesh around them would turn purple or black, as if bruised by invisible blows. Fever followed, fierce and consuming, and with it came delirium and thirsting that could not be quenched. Some patients also developed marks on their skin, spots and patches that spread across the chest and back. These too were dark, the colour of old bruises or spilled ink. It was from these marks that people began to call the pestilence the Black Death, though we knew it by many names. The Great Mortality, the Great Pestilence, the punishment of God. Master William tried every remedy he knew, and some he invented in desperation. We made poultices of lily root and onion to draw out the poison from the swellings. We applied leeches to drain the excess humours that Galenic theory taught were the source of fever. We burned juniper and bay in the sick rooms. We administered theriac mixed with wine. We bled patients from the arm or foot, believing that bad matter in the constitution needed release. Nothing worked. Or rather, nothing worked reliably. Sometimes a patient would improve after bleeding, but the next would grow weaker unto their final rest. Sometimes a poultice would cause a swelling to burst and drain, and the patient would recover, but more often the swelling would harden and spread, and the fever would not break. There was no pattern we could discern, no treatment we could trust. I remember a woman on Magdalen Street, a weaver's widow, who had nursed her husband through the sickness, only to fall ill herself a week after he was buried. Her daughter, barely 12 years old, sat beside the bed and held her hand, while Master William examined the swellings in her neck. They were already large and dark, and when he pressed them gently the woman gasped in pain. He mixed a poultice of crushed garlic and bread soaked in wine, a remedy said to draw out infection. The daughter helped him apply it to her mother's neck, and we left instructions to change it every few hours and to keep burning rosemary in the room. 3 days later, we returned to find the house empty. A neighbour told us both mother and daughter had been taken to the pest house outside the city walls, where those without family to care for them were gathered to await their end. I never learned what became of them, though I can guess. How many houses did we enter that winter? I cannot say. 50? 100? The days blurred together into a single grey expanse marked only by the work and the walking. My legs ached from climbing stairs to chambers where the sick lay. My hands grew rough from mixing remedies and handling herbs. My dreams, when I could sleep, were filled with the faces of people I could not help. Master William spoke less and less. At night he continued to read his ancient text by candlelight, but I noticed he no longer discussed what he found. His beard grew unkempt. His eyes, behind the leather mask, seemed to look at things beyond the visible world. Once, after we had attended a merchant's family where 3 of 5 had already succumbed, I asked him if he believed we were doing any good at all. He removed his mask slowly, setting it on the workbench. His face beneath was pale and drawn, and there were lines around his mouth I had not noticed before. "I do not know," he said, "but if we stop trying, we become accomplices to despair, and despair, boy, is a sickness that kills more surely than any pestilence." The city changed around us. The markets grew sparse as traders and farmers feared to enter the walls. Shops closed, their owners either gone or hiding. The streets, once bustling, became places of silence broken only by the sound of carts, carrying those who would not see another dawn to the burial grounds. The churches could not keep pace with the need for funerals. At first, each person was given proper rites, shrouded and buried in consecrated ground with prayers and ceremony. But as the numbers grew, the rituals shortened, then they ceased altogether. Great pits were dug outside the city walls, and the vessels left behind were laid in layers, one atop another, covered with lime and earth. I went to one of these pits once, accompanying Master William, who had been called to certify that certain patients had indeed reached their final silence, as the law required, before they could be removed from houses. The pit was at the edge of St. Faith's parish, a gash in the frozen earth perhaps 20 feet long and 10 feet deep. The smell reached us before we saw it, even through the herbs in our masks. It was the smell of decay, yes, but also of lime and smoke and something else, something sweet and terrible that I have no words for. Men worked at the edge, lowering wrapped forms on ropes, their faces bound with cloth and their movements mechanical, as if they had surrendered thought in order to continue. A priest stood at the edge, intoning prayers in Latin, but his voice was flat and hurried, as if the words themselves had lost their meaning through repetition. Somewhere behind us, a woman wailed, and the sound echoed across the frozen field before dying away into silence. Master William stood at the edge of the pit and looked down. I thought he might speak or pray, but he only stood there, still as stone, until the workers were done. Then he turned and walked back toward the city, and I followed. That night I heard him weeping in his chamber above the shop. The sound came through the floorboards, quiet but unmistakable. I lay in my attic among the drying herbs and listened, and I understood that we were not separate from the suffering around us, that bearing witness carved grooves in the soul as surely as water carves channels in stone. By February of 1349, the pestilence had claimed perhaps a third of Norwich's people. The exact count was impossible to know, as many had fled to the countryside, and many who reached their final rest were never recorded in any church register. Whole streets stood empty, houses gaped with broken shutters and open doors, looted by those desperate enough to risk the corruption that might linger in abandoned spaces. The city authorities attempted to maintain order through proclamation and force. They ordered the streets cleaned of refuse. They forbid the slaughter of animals within the walls. They required all fires to burn constantly to purify the air. They forbade public gatherings and closed the taverns. They posted guards at the gates to turn away those who appeared sick. None of it made any difference. The pestilence moved according to its own logic, if logic it had. It took the young and the old, the strong and the weak, the pious and the profane. It spared some houses and devastated others. It would vanish from a parish for a week, raising hopes that the worst had passed, then return with renewed fury. People sought explanations. The priest said it was punishment for sin, and who could argue? The world was indeed wicked. But which sins had called down this judgment? Usury, pride, failure to observe the fasts? The explanations varied depending on who spoke, and each seemed as plausible as the next. Some said the Jews had poisoned the wells, though Norwich had expelled its Jews decades before. Some said it was the result of an evil conjunction of planets, Saturn and Jupiter in the house of Aquarius, that had corrupted the air across all of Europe. Some said it was carried by beggars or strangers or cats or rats or simply by the wind itself. Master William said it was miasma, corrupt air rising from swamps and graveyards, entering the body through the breath and overwhelming the natural balance of humours. This was the teaching of Galen and Hippocrates, the wisdom of the ancients, and it made as much sense as anything else. But if corrupt air was the cause, why did some who breathed the same air remain healthy while others fell ill? Why did the pestilence sometimes spare those who nursed the sick, while taking those who kept their distance? These questions Master William could not answer, and I could see the doubt growing in him like a slow poison of its own. In March, a group of flagellants arrived in Norwich, perhaps 30 men walking in procession through the streets. They were clothed in white robes marked with red crosses, and they carried banners and candles. At certain places they would stop and form a circle, and then they would remove their robes to the waist and beat themselves with whips tipped with iron. I watched from the door of the shop as they performed their ritual in the square before St. Peter Mancroft. The sound of the whip striking flesh was like the crack of wet leather, and soon the men's backs were marked with what only rain could wash away. They sang hymns as they struck themselves, songs of penitence and divine mercy, and some of the people watching began to weep and pray aloud. "They believe suffering will appease God's wrath," Master William said beside me, "that if they punish themselves, he will lift the pestilence." "Will he?" I asked. Master William shook his head. "They have been doing this across Europe, I have heard, in Germany and France and the Low Countries, and still the pestilence continues. The flagellants left after a week, moving on to the next town, and the pestilence remained. April brought warmer weather and no relief. If anything, the pestilence seemed to strengthen with the spring. More cases appeared, more houses were marked with crosses, more carts rumbled through the streets before dawn. Master William grew more desperate in his experiments. He tried bleeding from different parts of the body, the foot, the hand, the temple. He tried cupping, placing heated glass bowls on the skin to draw out bad humours. He tried cautery, burning the swellings with hot irons in the belief that fire would cleanse what poultices could not. Some patients screamed during these treatments. Some begged him to stop. Some endured in silence, believing that suffering was part of the cure, that healing must hurt. None of it worked. I remember a baker's apprentice, a boy younger than myself, who developed a swelling under his arm. Master William tried first a poultice, then leeches, then burning. The boy bore it all with clenched teeth, his face grey with pain and fear. Afterward, Master William bandaged the wound and gave him a draught of poppy and wine to ease the hurt. The boy lasted 2 more days. The swelling did not shrink but spread, and the fever came, and then delirium. In his final hours he called for his mother, who had already been laid in the pit at St. Faith's 3 weeks before. After the boy reached his silence, Master William sat at the workbench and stared at his hands. They were stained with various tinctures and oils, the marks of his trade, and they trembled slightly as he held them before his face. "I have made it worse," he said, and his voice was barely a whisper. "The burning, the bleeding, I have added to his suffering without bringing relief." I did not know what to say. I was 18 years old and understood almost nothing of the world. I wanted to tell him that he had tried, that trying was better than abandoning the sick to their fate, but the words felt hollow even before I spoke them. "We do what we can," I said finally, and the inadequacy of it hung in the air between us. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in the attic, listening to the creaks of the old building and the distant tolling of bells, and I felt something inside me shift, like a foundation giving way beneath a structure built on sand. What if everything we believed was wrong? What if the remedies we administered did more harm than good? What if the prayers we offered rose no higher than the smoke from our fires? What if God, in his infinite wisdom, had simply decided that this generation would be swept away, and nothing we did could alter that judgment? These were dangerous thoughts, the kind that could lead to the spiritual sickness the priests called acedia, a deadening of the soul, a surrender to darkness. I tried to pray them away, but the prayers felt like words spoken into an empty room, and no answer came. Sometime in those dark hours I must have fallen into exhausted sleep, because I found myself in a dream that felt more real than waking. I was standing in the shop, but it was different. The walls were clean, the shelves fully stocked, the air clear and sweet. Sunlight streamed through the windows, bright as summer noon, though it had been night when I closed my eyes. Master William stood at the workbench, but he was younger, his beard dark instead of grey, his hands moving with confident purpose. He was mixing something in a mortar, grinding herbs with the pestle, and the sound of it was rhythmic and soothing. I approached him, and he looked up and smiled, something I had not seen him do in months. "Come, boy," he said, "I will teach you the secret." "What secret?" I asked. "The cure," he said, "the remedy that ends all suffering." He held out the mortar, and I looked inside. It was full of ash, grey and fine as powder, with no trace of herbs or medicine. I reached out to touch it, and as my fingers neared the ash, it began to move. swirling like water draining from a basin, forming a spiral that seemed to descend into infinite depth. "You see," Master William said, and his voice had changed, grown distant and echoing. "There is nothing. There was never anything. We have been grinding emptiness and calling it hope." I looked up at him, and his face was no longer his own but a skull, bone-white and hollow-eyed, the jaw hanging open in a perpetual silent scream. I tried to pull away, but my hand was already in the mortar, and the ash was rising, climbing up my arm like living smoke, cold and suffocating. I opened my mouth to cry out, but ash poured in, filling my throat, my lungs, turning everything grey and still and silent. I woke gasping, my heart hammering against my ribs. The attic was dark, the herbs hanging from the rafters swaying slightly in the draught from the eaves. My hand ached, and when I looked at it in the faint light, I saw that my fingernails were digging into my palm, leaving red crescents in the flesh. Just a dream. Only a dream. But the feeling of it stayed with me, the taste of ash in my mouth, the image of Master William's face transforming into the visage of the end of all things. I lay awake until dawn, afraid to close my eyes again, and when the sun finally rose and I descended to the shop, I found Master William already at work, grinding herbs in the mortar as if nothing had changed. Perhaps nothing had. Perhaps the dream was only my mind's attempt to process what my soul could not accept, that we were failing, that we had always been failing, and that all our knowledge and craft meant nothing in the face of this pestilence. I did not tell him about the dream. What would I have said? That I had seen him as a symbol of futility, that I doubted the very foundations of what he had taught me. He had burdens enough without carrying mine as well. The spring wore on. May came, and with it the warmer weather that should have brought relief. Instead, the pestilence seemed to flourish in the heat. The stench in the city grew worse, even with the fires burning and the streets cleaned daily. Flies multiplied, thick clouds of them that settled on everything. Rats, always present in the city, seemed to grow bolder, appearing in daylight, their eyes bright with a cunning that seemed almost human. New theories emerged about the cause and cure of the pestilence. A visiting scholar from Cambridge claimed that wearing emeralds would ward off the sickness, as the stone absorbed corrupt air. Emeralds being rare and costly, most people made do with green glass or painted pebbles, which proved equally useless. Another theory held that the pestilence could not abide certain smells, particularly the smell of filth and decay. This led some people to deliberately befoul their homes and persons, believing that the pestilence, being itself a corruption, would avoid places already corrupted. They stopped cleaning their floors, stopped washing their bodies, even kept chamber pots unsealed in their rooms. The result was predictable more disease, not less, as other sicknesses flourished in the squalor. Some sought protection in amulets and charms. They wore written prayers sealed in leather pouches around their necks. They carried the teeth of wolves or the claws of eagles. They drew symbols on their doors in chalk or paint crosses, circles, words in Latin or Hebrew, or languages invented from desperation. Did any of it help? Who could say? Those who wore amulets and survived claimed the amulets had saved them. Those who wore amulets and perished could make no claim at all. The logic of survival became impossible to follow, and in that impossibility, superstition flourished like weeds in untended soil. Master William continued to practice according to the principles he had learned, but I could see the faith draining from him like water from a cracked vessel. His hands still performed the familiar tasks, grinding, mixing, applying, but his eyes had gone distant, as if he were watching himself from somewhere far away. In late May, we were called to a house on Elm Hill, where a physician named Robert lay ill. He had been one of the few who had not fled the city, and he had attended the sick with courage that bordered on recklessness. Now the pestilence had claimed him, and his wife begged Master William to come, believing that one learned man might save another. We found Robert in his chamber, lying on a bed covered with fine linen. He had swellings in his neck and groin, already dark and large, and his skin was marked with the telltale patches. His face was flushed with fever, and his breathing came in shallow gasps. His wife stood at the foot of the bed, Her hands clutching a rosary so tightly her knuckles were white. She was perhaps 30 years old, still young, and her face held a terrible mixture of hope and certainty, as if she knew the outcome but could not surrender to it. Master William examined the swellings with gentle fingers, and Robert, even in his extremity, watched with professional interest, as if his own suffering were a case study. "What would you do?" Robert whispered, his voice dry as autumn leaves. Master William was silent for a long moment. Then he reached into his bag and withdrew a vial of theriac, the precious compound that was supposed to cure all ills. "I would give you this," he said, "but I do not believe it will help." Robert smiled, a ghastly expression on his fever-flushed face. "Nor do I, but give it anyway, for hope's sake." Master William mixed the theriac with wine and helped Robert drink it. The physician's wife watched with desperate attention, as if the act of administering medicine were itself a form of prayer. We stayed for an hour, making what comfort we could, which was to say, almost none. Before we left, Robert called Master William to lean close. "We know nothing," Robert whispered. "All our learning, all our art, we know nothing." Master William said nothing, but his hand trembled as he gathered his tools. Robert reached his final silence 2 days later. His wife followed him within a week. Their house stood empty for a month before it was looted. After attending Robert, Master William began to change. He still came to the shop each day and performed his work, but there was a mechanical quality to it, as if he were following a script he no longer believed. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words were clipped and empty of emotion. One evening in early June, I found him in the workroom after dark, sitting at the workbench with no candle lit. The moon shone through the window, casting his shadow long across the floor. "Master?" I said. He did not turn. "I've been thinking about Robert's words, that we know nothing. He was correct, of course, but it is worse than that." "Worse how?" "We do not merely fail to know. We delude ourselves that we know. We take ancient texts as truth simply because they are ancient. We trust in remedies because they have been trusted before. We mistake repetition for wisdom and tradition for understanding." He picked up the mortar from the workbench, the same mortar I had seen in my dream, though I had told him nothing of it. "How many people have I bled in the last 6 months?" he asked. 50, 100, and how many were helped by it? Perhaps none. Perhaps I have hastened their end with my learned ignorance. "You tried to help them," I said, echoing what I had said months before, knowing it was still inadequate. "Trying is not enough," he said. "Good intentions pave the road to ruin as surely as malice. I have been a barber pretending to be a surgeon, a conjurer pretending to be a philosopher. What else could you have done?" He set down the mortar and finally turned to look at me. His face in the moonlight was haggard and strange, like that of a man who had aged a decade in months. "I could have admitted I did not know," he said. "I could have sat beside the sick and held their hands and prayed with them, rather than tormenting them with useless remedies. I could have offered comfort instead of false hope. Is there a difference between comfort and hope? Perhaps not. But there is a difference between false hope and honest mercy." He stood then, moving slowly like an old man, though he was not yet 55. "I am going to my chamber, close the shop in the morning. We will no longer pretend to cure what we cannot even comprehend." He climbed the stairs, and I heard his door close softly. I stood alone in the workroom, surrounded by jars and bottles and bundles of herbs, all the tools of a trade that had failed to matter when it was needed most. Should I have argued with him? Should I have tried to restore his faith in what we did? I do not know. I was 18 years old, an apprentice in craft and understanding both, and I had no wisdom to offer, only questions that multiplied like rats in darkness. Master William was true to his word. The next morning he hung a closed sign on the shop door. He spent his days in his chamber, reading or praying or simply sitting. I could not tell which. He ate little. He spoke less. It was as if he had already crossed over into the territory of shadows and was simply waiting for his flesh to follow. I remained in the shop, uncertain what to do. I was not a master, had no authority to practice on my own, but neither could I abandon the building or the trade entirely. People still came, knocking on the door, seeking help that I could not give. Some I turned away with apologies. Others I helped in small ways, selling them herbs for fumigation, mixing simple poultices that I knew would do no harm even if they did no good. I charged them little or nothing, as our supplies were still substantial, and there seemed no point in profiting from desperation. One day, a woman came with her daughter, a girl of perhaps 10 years, who had developed a fever but showed no swellings yet. The woman begged me for something to bring down the fever, anything that might prevent the worst. I mixed a draught of willow bark and feverfew in wine, a simple remedy for common fevers, and gave it to her with instructions to keep the girl cool and rested. "Will she live?" the woman asked, and her eyes held such desperate pleading that I felt my throat close. I could have said yes. I could have lied to give her hope. I could have hidden behind platitudes about God's will or the mysteries of medicine. Instead, I told her the truth. I do not know, no one knows, but this may ease her discomfort, and that is worth something. The woman's face crumpled, but she took the draught and thanked me and left. Whether the girl recovered or not, I never learned. Afterward, I sat on the stool behind the workbench and felt something settle inside me, a weight that was also a clarity. This, then, was all I could offer. Small comforts, honest ignorance, and the presence of someone who had not yet fled. It was not much, it was perhaps nothing at all. But it was honest, and in a world drowning in false remedies and empty promises, honesty felt like the only thing worth offering. The summer of 1349 arrived with heat that turned the city into an oven. The sun beat down on the narrow streets, and the smell of decay hung in the air like a physical presence. The pestilence continued its work, though by now the initial terror had been replaced by a kind of numbed acceptance. People went about their business, with the weariness of soldiers in a war that had no end in sight. The churches remained open, though many priests had succumbed or fled. Those who remained performed their duties with stoic devotion, hearing confessions, administering last rites, presiding over burials that grew ever more hasty and impersonal. The bishop himself fell ill in July and reached his final rest within 4 days, and for a time there was chaos in the ecclesiastical hierarchy. Master William emerged from his chamber less and less. Sometimes I would climb the stairs and find him sitting by the window, staring out at the street below, his lips moving in silent conversation with himself or with God. His hair had gone completely white, and his hands shook even when he held them still. Once I brought him bread and cheese, and he looked at me as if surprised to find me still there. "You should leave," he said. "Go to the countryside, find a village that has been spared. You are young, you have a life ahead of you." "So do you," I said, though we both knew this was becoming less certain with each passing day. He shook his head. "I am old and tired and emptied of purpose. If the pestilence takes me, it will be a mercy. But you should not waste your youth watching the world end." "Is it ending?" I asked. "The world?" He smiled, a thin and bitter expression. "Perhaps not the world, but the world as we knew it. That is ending. What comes after, I cannot imagine." I left him with the food and returned to the shop, and I thought about his words through the rest of that hot July day. Was I wasting my youth? Perhaps. But where would I go that was safer? The pestilence had spread across all of England, all of Europe, or so the rumours said. Cities, villages, monasteries, none were spared. At least here in the shop on Pottergate, I knew the shape of my days, knew what was expected of me, even if that expectation had dwindled to almost nothing. In August, a group of survivors began meeting at St. Peter Mancroft to organise relief for those who had no one to care for them. They called themselves the Brethren of the Pestilence, and they sought volunteers to visit the sick, bring them food and water, and ensure they did not meet their end alone and forgotten. I joined them, more from restlessness than virtue. The meetings were held in the evening, after the heat of the day had passed, and perhaps 20 people attended, artisans and merchants, widows and unmarried women, 1 or 2 minor clergy. They were ordinary people who had survived thus far and felt compelled to do something, anything, rather than simply wait. A mercer named John, who had lost his wife and both sons, organised the effort. He was perhaps 40 years old, gaunt and hollow-eyed, but there was a fierce determination in him, that reminded me of a candle burning in a drafty room, flickering but refusing to go out. "We cannot cure this pestilence," he said at the first meeting, "but we can bear witness. We can ensure that people do not suffer alone. We can bring water to the thirsty and prayer to the dying. This is the commandment, to love our neighbour. If we abandon it now, what are we?" Some nodded, others looked uncertain. A widow named Alice asked if we were not simply hastening our own end by exposing ourselves to the sickness. "Perhaps," John said, "but if we hide in our homes in fear, are we truly living, or have we already surrendered to the darkness?" I thought of Master William, sitting alone in his chamber, already gone in all but flesh. I thought of my dream, the ash rising to suffocate me. I thought of the merchant who had first brought news of the pestilence 7 months ago that felt like 7 years, and his words about strange sickness in the port cities. "I will help," I said, and my voice sounded strange to my own ears, younger than I felt. So began the last months of the pestilence year, though we did not know they were the last. We only knew the present, which stretched on with no promise of ending. Each evening, John assigned us to different households or streets. We carried food and water, blankets and firewood. We cleaned those who could no longer clean themselves. We prayed with those who desired it. We sat beside those who wished for company in their final hours. I saw things in those months that I have never spoken of until now, things that remain burned into my memory like brands into leather. I saw a mother who had outlived all 5 of her children, sitting in an empty house with the bodies around her, unable or unwilling to call for their removal. I saw a man who had lost his wits entirely, wandering naked through his home, laughing and singing as if at a feast. I saw a child, no more than 6 years old, nursing her younger brother alone, both parents already gone, her small face set with a determination that made my chest ache. I saw courage and cowardice, faith and despair, cruelty and compassion, all mixed together in proportions that defied understanding. People are not simple, I learned. Even in extremity, especially in extremity, they contain multitudes. The brethren of the pestilence did not perform miracles. We did not cure anyone. We did not stop the dying. But we bore witness, and perhaps that mattered. Perhaps the dying found some comfort in not being alone. Perhaps the living found some purpose in serving. Or perhaps we were all just trying to maintain our humanity in circumstances designed to strip it away. Many of the brethren fell ill themselves. Alice the widow succumbed in September. A carpenter named Thomas followed in October. Others simply stopped coming to the meetings, and we did not know if they had died or fled or merely surrendered to exhaustion. John himself developed swellings in November, and I visited him in his house, a fine merchant's dwelling now eerily empty. He lay in his bed, already consumed by fever, and when I entered, he smiled with cracked lips. "The service continues," he whispered. "Someone must do it." "Someone will," I promised, though I did not know if it was true. He died 2 days later, and I helped carry his vessel to the pit, and I said the prayers I remembered, and I wept for him, for all of them, for myself, for the world that was ending whether we acknowledged it or not. By December, the pestilence began to loosen its grip. The new cases grew fewer. The bells tolled less frequently. The carts made fewer journeys to the burial grounds. It was not a sudden end, but a gradual ebbing, like a tide withdrawing after the storm. People emerged from their houses cautiously, as if expecting the pestilence to return at any moment. They looked at each other with strange eyes, uncertain whether to rejoice at their survival or mourn what had been lost. The city was emptier, quieter, wounded in ways that would take years to heal if they ever healed at all. Master William survived, though I am not certain he was grateful for it. He had grown skeletal, his clothes hanging loose on his frame, and when he finally descended from his chamber in late December, he looked around the shop as if seeing it for the first time. "I thought I would die," he said simply. "I wanted to die." "But you did not," I said. "No. God in his wisdom has seen fit to grant me more years, though I cannot fathom why. Perhaps as punishment, perhaps as opportunity. I no longer presume to know his purposes." He looked at me, and something in his eyes had changed. The despair was still there, but beneath it or beside it was something else. Resignation, perhaps, or acceptance, or simply exhaustion so profound it resembled peace. "You kept the shop," he said, gesturing at the shelves, the workbench, the supplies that had dwindled but not disappeared. "I did what I could," I said. "That is all any of us can do." He paused, then added, "I was wrong to close the doors. Even if we cannot cure, even if we fail more often than we succeed, the trying matters. The presence matters. You understood that better than I did." I did not know what to say to that, so I said nothing. Master William lived another 2 years, though he was never the same. The fire that had driven him to study, to experiment, to seek answers in ancient texts, that fire had been extinguished. He worked in the shop with steady competence but without passion, as if performing a duty rather than practicing an art. He trained me properly in those 2 years, teaching me what he knew, making me read the Latin texts aloud until I could parse their meaning, showing me the subtle variations in mixing and dosing that separated help from harm. He made me a master in all but name, and when he finally succumbed to a winter fever in the year of our Lord 1351, he left me the shop and all its contents in his will. I was 20 years old, a master apothecary, a survivor of the great pestilence. I should have felt triumph or relief or gratitude. Instead, I felt only the weight of what had been lost and the responsibility of carrying forward knowledge that had proven inadequate when it mattered most. I ran the shop for another 5 years. I served the people of Norwich with the remedies I had learned, the ancient wisdom mixed with the hard lessons of experience. I bled patients more sparingly, applied poultices more carefully, and I never, ever promised a cure when I could not be certain. Most importantly, I told the truth. When people asked if a remedy would work, I said it might, or it might not. But here is what we could try, and here is what I had seen work before, and here is what seemed to cause more harm than good. I gave them honesty wrapped in whatever comfort I could offer, and if that was not enough, at least it was not a lie. But the weight of memory grew heavier, not lighter. The faces of the dying haunted my sleep. The sound of cartwheels on cobblestones woke me in the night. The smell of burning rosemary made my stomach turn. I could not walk past St. Faith's Field without seeing the pit, though it had been filled and grass had grown over it. In the year 1356, when I was 25 years old, I sold the shop to another apothecary and took vows at the Benedictine Priory of Norwich. I became Brother Thomas, seeking in prayer and contemplation what I had failed to find in medicine and craft. Some understanding of why the pestilence had come, why so many had been taken, why I had been spared. I have been a monk for 17 years now. I have prayed daily, studied scripture, copied manuscripts, tended the priory's herb garden, and served my brothers with what skill and dedication I possess. And still I do not have answers. Perhaps there are no answers. Perhaps the pestilence was no more meaningful than a flood or a fire, a natural catastrophe that required no divine explanation. Perhaps we suffered because suffering is part of the human condition, and seeking purpose in it is like seeking purpose in the rain. Or perhaps there is meaning I am too limited to perceive, a pattern too vast for my small understanding to encompass. Perhaps God works in ways that would break our minds if we saw them clearly, and our ignorance is itself a mercy. I do not know. After all these years, after all I have witnessed and endured, I can say with certainty only this. I do not know, but I remember. God help me, I remember everything. I remember Master William's hands, stained and trembling, mixing remedies that did not work. I remember Robert the physician, asking for theriac he knew would not save him. I remember John the mercer, organising service, even as the darkness closed around him. I remember the weaver's widow and her daughter, the baker's apprentice who called for his mother, the child nursing her brother alone. I remember the smell of burning rosemary and tar, the sound of bells tolling through the night, the taste of vinegar-soaked bread, the texture of leather masks and linen shrouds. I remember houses marked with red crosses, streets empty of life, pits filled with the vessels left behind. I remember the desperation in people's eyes when they came seeking help, the hope that flickered and died when no help came. I remember my own helplessness, my own doubt, my own small acts of service that felt like drops of water offered against an inferno. And I remember the dream, the ash rising to suffocate me, Master William's face transforming into bone and emptiness, and the terrible understanding that we had been grinding nothing, mixing hope from despair and calling it medicine. Were we wrong to try? I have wrestled with this question for 2 decades. Should we have simply prayed and trusted in God's will, rather than inflicting our ignorant remedies on the suffering? Should we have admitted our helplessness sooner, spared people the false hope and the real pain of our interventions? I do not believe so, though I understand why Master William came to think otherwise. We were physicians and apothecaries, practitioners of a craft that had been passed down through generations. We did what we had been taught, what seemed reasonable according to the understanding of our time. That our understanding was inadequate does not mean the trying was wrong. Even now, nearly 3 decades after the pestilence, physicians and apothecaries continue to use many of the same remedies we used then. They bleed patients for fever. They apply poultices to swellings. They prescribe theriac and burn herbs and invoke the wisdom of Galen and Hippocrates. Perhaps they are right to do so. Perhaps some of these remedies do help, in ways we cannot measure or prove. Or perhaps they are as lost as we were, stumbling in darkness and calling it illumination. I do not judge them. How could I? I did the same. What I have learned, if I have learned anything, is this. We are smaller than we think, more ignorant than we imagine, more limited than we can accept. The world is vast and strange and filled with forces beyond our comprehension. Disease and death are woven into the fabric of existence, and our attempts to unravel them are like children pulling threads from a tapestry, hoping to understand the whole from the fragments in our hands. But we must try anyway. Not because trying guarantees success, but because not trying guarantees surrender. We must reach for knowledge, even knowing it will always be partial. We must offer comfort, even when comfort seems pointless. We must bear witness, even when witnessing breaks us. This is what it means to be human, to persist in the face of futility, to seek meaning in the midst of chaos, to offer love when love seems powerless to change anything. We burned incense against the air. We prayed against the wind. We bled ourselves for mercy. None of it worked, not in the way we hoped. Yet somehow we remained. Some of us. Enough of us. And in that remaining, in that stubborn refusal to be entirely erased, there is perhaps a kind of victory, small and bitter as it may be. The city of Norwich survived. England survived. Europe survived. The world did not end, though it came close enough that those of us who lived through it will never forget the feeling of standing at the edge of oblivion and looking down into the abyss. New children were born. New houses were built. New shops opened on streets that had stood empty. The wounds began to heal, as wounds do, though the scars remained and remained still. The pestilence changed us, changed the world, in ways that will echo through generations we will never see. And I am still here, Brother Thomas, 43 years old, writing by candlelight in the scriptorium of Norwich Priory. My hand still trembles, though whether from age or memory I cannot say. Outside, the bells are ringing for vespers, and the light is fading from the sky, and somewhere in the city, someone is mixing herbs in a mortar, grinding and grinding, hoping to cure what cannot be cured, to heal what remains stubbornly broken. Would you have believed the cure could be worse than the disease? Could you have swallowed hope when it smelled of vinegar and ash? Could you have offered comfort when you had no comfort to give? These are not rhetorical questions. They are the questions I lived, the questions that haunt me still. And if you, reading this in some future I cannot imagine, ever face such questions yourself, if pestilence or war or catastrophe comes to your door, I hope you find better answers than we did. But if you do not, if you find yourself as lost and helpless as we were, at least know this. You are not the first. Others have walked this road before you. Others have struggled and failed and tried again anyway. Others have borne witness to suffering they could not prevent and offered service that seemed too small to matter, and they remained. We remained. That is all I have to offer you, the testimony of one who lived, one who witnessed, one who tried and failed and continued anyway. Make of it what you will, learn what you can, do better than we did, if you are able, but do not judge us too harshly. We did what we could, with what we knew, in the time we were given. We ground our herbs and mixed our tinctures and bled our patients and prayed our prayers, and when all of it failed, we wept and endured, and carried on. Because that is what humans do. It is what we have always done. It is perhaps all we can do. The candle on my desk is burning low. The other brothers have already gone to chapel for evening prayers. I should join them, should add my voice to theirs in the familiar rhythms of worship, seeking in ritual what reason cannot provide. But first, I needed to write this, needed to set down what I remember before memory fades, or I reach my own final silence. Someone should know what it was like, what we tried, what we believed, how we struggled against the darkness with tools that proved inadequate and hearts that broke beneath the weight of failure. Someone should remember that we were here, that we witnessed, that we cared enough to try even when trying seemed futile, that we were not heroes but ordinary people thrust into extraordinary circumstances, doing our poor best with limited understanding and unlimited need. Someone should know that the pestilence came and ravaged and passed and left us changed in ways we are still discovering, that it taught us the limits of our knowledge and the depths of our courage and the terrible price of survival. And someone should know that despite everything, despite the dying and the failing, the helplessness and the horror, the despair that crushed Master William and the doubt that nearly crushed me, despite all of it, there was also this: people who did not flee, who stayed and served and suffered alongside those who had no one else. John the mercer, organising relief until the pestilence took him. Alice the widow, visiting the sick until she became one of them. Master William, teaching me even in his despair. The countless others whose names I never learned, who brought water to the thirsty and prayer to the dying, who bore witness when bearing witness was all that remained. They mattered. Their service mattered. Not because it stopped the pestilence, it did not. Not because it saved everyone, it could not. But because it meant that when the darkness came, we did not face it entirely alone. Because it meant that humanity persisted not just in survival but in compassion, in the stubborn insistence that caring for each other matters even when nothing else seems to. This is what I choose to remember in the end, not just the suffering and the failure, though those are real and must not be forgotten, but also the reaching toward each other in the midst of catastrophe, the offering of comfort even when comfort seemed useless, the bearing of witness even when witnessing broke our hearts. We burned incense against the air, we prayed against the wind, we bled ourselves for mercy. None of it worked, yet somehow we remained. And in that remaining, in that refusal to surrender entirely to darkness, there was something worth preserving, worth remembering, worth passing on to whoever comes after. This is my testimony. This is what I witnessed and endured. This is what I have carried for 26 years, and what I will carry until my own journey ends. May you never need it. But if you do, may you find in it some small comfort, some recognition that you are not alone, that others have walked this road before you and survived, scarred but unbroken. May you do better than we did. May your knowledge be greater, your remedies more effective, your understanding deeper than ours. May you cure what we could not, heal what we could only witness, prevent what we could only endure. But if you cannot, if despite your best efforts the darkness still comes, if despite your knowledge and skill the suffering continues, if despite everything you try nothing seems to work, then do what we did. Try anyway, serve anyway, bear witness anyway, reach toward each other in the darkness and refuse to let go. Remain. The bell is ringing. Evening prayers begin. I must go now, must join my brothers in the chapel, must add my voice to theirs in the ancient words that have been spoken through plague and war and all the long centuries of human suffering. But before I go, I make the sign of the cross over these pages. blessing the words and the memories they contain. And I pray for Master William, and for Robert, and for John, and for all the others whose names I remember, and whose names I have forgotten, that they may rest in peace, and that their struggles and their service may not be forgotten, may not be wasted, may somehow matter in the great accounting that only God can make. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen.